This is turn 45 of Degeneracy. In the Old Land, our Revenant continues to raid back into Atlantis' territory, from the territory which he had conquered from us. Here in Olur, we raid a province from Agartha which had this Bloodhead Druid in it, so an additional source of blood slaves for the guy who had taken blood on his pretender. Here in Gladewood, Joman pokes the province which my army had been hiding in with a daimyo under the supposition that they were going to stay, but they did not. Here in Black Gorge, we raid another province from Atlantis with just a little ghostly raiding party. In the Great Dunes, we take back that desert province from Marignon. Here in the Pit, we get very lucky with a morale check once again and repel an attack from Atlantis. Dragon Point was the fort which we had under siege, and as expected, he takes it back with that stack. Here in Hergendorf, we once again raid a province from Agartha. In Ampholia, we see this stack is continuing to basically withdraw back towards Marignon's territory while still trying to capture a couple of our provinces en route. In Tiradir, a relatively small force of Marignon's guys takes over a province which had a little bit of PD and some indie crossbows, so we lose some real troops there. In Kunaral, Atlantis is using these awful underwater recruit infantries to take back an underwater province. Here in Hobergdorf, we see those two Morkels once again counter-raiding to take one of our provinces back. In Black Peaks, Joman has made a horrible mistake and has forgotten to include most of his mages in the patrolling army. As a result, we take barely any losses. Almost all of these losses are just in these dispossessed spirits here, and we're basically just trading a couple of shades for a Soulless Warrior while wiping out a huge amount of Joman's front line. So this is actually a very big deal just because Joman is going to have such a hard time replacing these guys, given how small his army had been to begin with. This means that many of his mages are now trapped inside of this fort without a front line to actually go with them. That means that it's going to be all that much easier to actually kill those mages once we break down the walls. Here in Momef, we get caught by Agartha, or rather, Agartha just doesn't move his mages away, and our tiny little raiding party pays the price for that check. But it was definitely well worth it, since we didn't really lose anything. We can keep doing that pretty much every turn. Here in Renthale, we see a couple of mages supported by demons and so on, capturing one of our provinces. So definitely a good turn for Marignon in terms of his offensive, given that we took back only one of our provinces from him and lost 3 more. Here in Mictlan, we actually successfully predicted the fact that Mictlan was moving his armies around to try to recapture that throne, and as a result he has a relatively small force patrolling here. While he does have some Jaguar warriors, and his province defense actually includes a couple more Jaguars, a couple more of the Jaguar warriors. I think it's just these two right down here. Oh no, those guys have experience stars, so it must be these guys there. It's still a relatively small number of sacreds, given the number of ghosts which are attacking it. We've already been over the effectiveness of Rigor Mortis against these Blood 9 Sacreds. The fact that Mictlan cast Leech there means that he does have Blood 7, which means he can potentially have his very dangerous Blood Assassins. However, these Grand Lemurs are among the few mages which are actually capable of surviving Leech, just based on their very high base HP values. Additionally, they will default to summoning skeletons, or potentially, if they have D4, casting Drain Life right back at the Poochie, which means that they can actually survive an assassination attempt, unlike most nations' mages. So those Clouds of Death are quite deadly, and luckily our mages are not taking very much damage back in response, in part because not all of these guys have actually been blessed. It looks like these guys all have been, though, so it's actually kind of a good thing that the Clouds kind of missed. But they're going to be very effective against these Slingers which don't have that Blood Vengeance to punish my mages for using that powerful evocation. One of our squads seriously messed up our morale check, so a bunch of these spectral guys are running away. But we've already gone through all of his sacreds, and as a result, he's left with only these very weak slingers, some of which have already been placed close to the fear auras from our apparitions, which means that they're probably not going to last very long either. And while a couple of our squads are routed in the process, we do manage to rout Mictlan's army. And we even managed to kill a few exhausted priests in the process. So we definitely do lose some guys there, and we actually have even fewer guys than are listed here with the army, given that a couple of our squads routed. But we did get rid of 2 of Mictlan's priests, Mictlan's fairly high base province capital defense, and most importantly, their capital is now under siege. The fact that we killed a bunch of Jaguar warriors also definitely helps. So, now we're going to look at the big battle of the turn, in which we attack Atlantis to try to rescue our besieged fort. So we've already seen Atlantis' setup right over here. His mages are self-buffing with Stygian skin, and while invulnerability is not going to be useful against our magic weapon ghosts, it is going to be useful against battlefield clear effects, which means that essentially his mages are going to be resistant to Rain of Stones and Earthquake. We can see that the nether darts are not particularly effective against the green lions because of their very, very high base magic resistance. 16 base MR means that they're incredibly likely to resist spells that don't have significant amount of magic penetration. His Dust to Dust is going to be doing a bunch of damage there, but we can see here that when even wolves, which are not particularly threatening, when they're surrounding the green lines like this, are actually still capable of dealing damage to them, which means that our essentially suicide frontline thing here is still going to be fairly effective. The other thing which is working in my favor is that the fact that I have all these wolves here actually devalues these squares of green lions for friendly evocation, because our casters are going to be trying to avoid friendly fire, which means that they're going to be casting these MRN spells into these blocks of Atlantean infantry preferentially instead, in spite of the fact that they're further away. And those are much more effective. We can also see that the arrow fence spell went up, which means that everyone is now air shielded, which is going to protect them against all these enemy crossbows. However, the huge amount of D1 casters which Atlantis brought is going to be wiping out these ghosts quite effectively, even though they're casting a relatively low level spell. Wither Bones is doing the same thing in a much larger area. And we can start seeing basically that both of our evocations are taking effect, so we're essentially just trading front lines while our mages are doing all the killing. This is always definitely going to be in Lemuria's favor thanks to the fact that my units are so plentiful, whereas Atlantis typically requires on quality over raw quantity to win. We can also see that these Storms of Thorns, in addition to doing damage, are helping tie a bunch of these guys up. Along with the Shadow Blasts, which are paralyzing units as well. This is basically keeping his guys from, or is going to keep his guys from all surrounding my ghosts at the same time, as his guys are going to be trickling forward while many of them are bound by paralysis or ensnared. These gargoyles had been set to attack large monsters under the hopes that they would be attacking these Angakocks here, which are size 4. Unfortunately, size 4 does not count as a large monster, unlike what it says in the manual, and they are going for these water elementals instead. So you can see here now that Atlantis' guys are going forward, but many of them are still stuck here in the poison clouds. Oh yeah, and you can see that these guys here are also just attacking these regular Atlanteans, in spite of the fact they've been set to attack large monsters, so presumably they're just attacking like kind of random targets. It's worth noting that these green lines are not actually immune to rigor mortis. In spite of the fact that they have no encumbrance and are mindless, they're not lifeless or undead, so as a result the rigor mortis is still increasing their fatigue, which is decreasing their effective attack and defense rolls. Additionally, rigor mortis is continuing to take effect on his guys, and while it is random in terms of how effective it is, and his sacreds also do have reinvigoration, it is potentially reducing the combat qualities of quite a few of them. Additionally, as you can see, many of his guys are still held up right over here, which means that my ghosts are surrounding him in spite of the fact that he had his guys set up along a slightly wider line at the start of the fight. Many of our wolves are now routing, and these gargoyles are also taking quite a bit of damage from being stuck into melee, but this is actually a very good place for us to keep these Atlantean warriors, given that they're sitting in these poison clouds and continuing to take more damage over time as a result. Our communions defaulted to casting Stellar Cascades, which pumps the fatigue from these already rigor mortis weakened Atlanteans up even further. It's worth taking time to note that their base morale was actually just really incredible, thanks in part to the fact that they had a divine morale buff. But many of the, so you can see here that between the experience, their morale buff, and the high leadership from their Engakuks, which have a base leadership of, I think, 120, many of his squads just had too high of a morale for Wailing Winds alone to get rid of them. Luckily, however, while many of our ghosts and pretty much all of our wolves have routed, we have more than enough additional summoned frontline from the summoned dead from our D2 mages, now that their script is ended, to ensure that our side doesn't HP rout, and it looks like Atlantis' armies already have. And we can see here that some of his mages have already been completely fatigued out and held in place, which means that they're not even going to be able to retreat. But luckily, we also cut retreat paths, so all of these retreating units are dead as well. And with that, All of these units are gone, including the ones that it says have survived. We've killed 4 of these very expensive, capital-only, slow-to-recruit enormous mages. We've stolen a couple of his ice guards and acertuts. We lost a huge amount of chaff and 4 of the shamans which we had as communion slaves, as well as a couple of our animated gargoyles, but the chaff loss is essentially negligible, and the loss of Atlantis' army is massive. The number of troops which we brought to the battle is actually fairly similar, in spite of the fact that Atlantis had vastly superior quality troops. However, the mage numbers basically tell the whole story. We just had a huge number of shamans, all set up in that enormous communion. We had a large number of Lemur acolytes which were casting very efficient evocation spells, and we had both our Pretender and a Grand Lemur to cast battlefield-wide spells as well. Even if Atlantis had somehow managed to win that frontline war, and we just had terrible morale checks on our ghosts and so on, and we completely lost our frontline, the reapplied frontline from the Horde of Skeletons casts and raised dead casts from our mages once their script ended would have ensured that we would have been able to hold out for the fight a little bit longer, and the fact that we were using those battlefield-wide attrition spells of Wailing Winds and Rigor Mortis would have all but ensured that we won the battle, even if our frontline had collapsed more quickly than it did. So this was essentially an all but guaranteed victory from the get-go, just based on the sheer mismatch in mage power, and the fact that my script was a fair bit better as well. So, we have cleared the Atlantean assault from our lands. We have started to destroy the gate in Mictlan, the gate in the Black Peaks, and the gate in Toledo. We are under siege here, and our walls are damaged. This is Mictlan's army right over here, but we know more or less exactly what that army contains, and we can try to kick it off. We're going to be first since we have one more turn, we're not going to be charging full bore at it quite yet. Instead, we're going to be sending a scout basically just to investigate, and we're going to be spreading out our army just a little bit in order to basically try to capture these provinces right over here, and we expect Mictlan to move this army back up in order to try to kick us off of his capital now that it's under siege. So rather than try to hold on to it, and given that we don't know everything that this army is going to entail quite yet, all we know is that it has a large number of sacreds, and we know that many of the guys which had been over here were moving on to it. We don't necessarily want to take that fight quite yet. So we're basically just going to spread out a little bit, raid around the area, while getting ready to potentially fight for this fort, or give it up if we have to. This fight right over here, though, is one that we're definitely going to take. We're going to try to hold this fortress under siege and actually break down the walls. Over here, we're going to try to siege the Mercs, which is in Joman's cap circle. It's his only fort outside of his capital, and this one right over here, given that he's essentially all but defeated at this point. We're going to be using this mercenary company to attack into here. His huge number of priests here would be fairly effective against a ghostly raiding party, but won't do anything against the cavalry. If his province defense is high enough, they are still going to win, so it's definitely not a sure thing by any means. But we are also going to try to hold the siege over here under the supposition that these Jomanese priests are not going to be enough in order to kick us off. As you can see here, Atlantis just got smashed by the fact that he lost all those guys right over here. We're going to be building a lab inside of this fort, basically just to make give us a little bit of ease of gem use, while these guys are basically going to be hanging out with our army for now, and calling up additional shadows in order to bolster up that front line which we lost. And given that we've shown Atlantis that we can actually beat his army, we are going to potentially be moving a conventional force down over here, or if we feel the need to, move that same conventional force up here in order to try to take Marignan head on. We're basically just going to try to let diplomacy prevail with Marignan as much as possible, just so that we can focus our resources on the people who we know are going to be fighting us essentially forever, namely Agartha, who is currently in the best position to actually win the game still, Atlantis, who has just dedicated himself wholly to my removal in spite of that massive setback which he just suffered, and Mictlan, which is basically just being destroyed by us. Oh, and Joman, who, like Mictlan, is just being conquered. So it's definitely possible that diplomacy is not going to work, and we're going to need to continue fighting Marignan, but for now we're going to hold this army here and decide where to go only afterwards. Given that there's no lab here, we also can't set these all of these guys to research right away, so many of them are going to be moving back down into there. And given that they have swamp survival, that's not going to delay their movement by all too much. Speaking of research, we've just finished Alteration 4 as mentioned. We have Evocation 7, which is vital for our battlefield cleared spells, and we're going to be going a little bit deeper into Alteration in order to try to get to Wooden Warriors and then eventually Mass Protection. Because our skeletons have no base protection, that's going to be very useful in increasing their survivability. So yeah, things are definitely looking bright in spite of the fact that much of our territory is still under attack, just based on the fact that we have had so many good military wins against Atlantis in repelling their assault, and the fact that we are poised to conquer Joman and Mictlan entirely. And that's the turn.